This couldn't happen again. This is that one. This couldn't happen again. This is that one. This couldn't happen again. This is that one.
Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to tonight's PodChats. We are so excited to have you here tonight. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few different things for tonight's program in terms of Zoom. So we're going to be doing things a little bit differently tonight. Josiah has created a really beautiful presentation for us, and we're just going to keep all of the questions and discussions till the end tonight. So feel free to pop your questions in the chat if you don't want to forget them, but just hold those to the end. And without further, I'm going to pass things over to Meg to introduce our host tonight.
Hey everyone, my name's Meg Wilcox, and I am, I guess, the curator, sort of the lead presenter of PodChat. So we may have met previously at previous sessions. And I am a podcast prof. I also do other work in podcasting in the city. But what we're doing with PodChats, as you know, is to make it sort of a book club, but for podcasts. And I wanted to bring in some really great speakers, people that can talk about different things that are happening in the city in terms of podcasting, but also share their unique experiences. So thank you for joining tonight. I'm really excited for Josiah's presentation. I will mention that if you want to put your camera on, it's always a little easier to not talk to a bunch of icons. I do it currently at MRU sometimes, inviting my students to come put on their cameras, only if you're comfortable. But it is always great to see some faces when you are looking to present. But I did want to mention, I mean, now that we've sort of see some friendly faces, thank you for putting on your cameras. I appreciate it. I know Josiah will. And I'll introduce Josiah. And so Josiah Sinanan. He is the host and producer of the Anticulture podcast, and it's based right here in Calgary. It started in 2018 and it's wrapped up its third season. And if you're a podcaster, you know that getting a first season is tough, let alone a third season. So that's a pretty big accomplishment. The podcast itself, Anticulture, it seeks to challenge and reestablish our view on what culture and identity really mean. And the whole idea is by listening intently to the unique experiences of those around us. And so, in Josiah's view, the true culture of an individual in their lives is only found out when we really take the time to hear what they've experienced from their own point of view. And I think it's fair to say, as what we're seeing in the media these days, in the news, being able to listen to someone that we disagree with, to engage with them and to understand where they come from, at least to make an effort, I think is a really important thing. And so that's part of the reason I think it's so great to have Josiah here today as part of PodChats, because he's going to talk about his interviewing techniques and how he prepares to interview with an open mind, even in the case that he knows he's going to interview someone that he may disagree with. So Josiah, I'll let you take things over now. Thank you so much for coming and presenting today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited, and thank you to everyone who joined. Yeah, I have, as our lovely host mentioned, I do have a bit of a presentation put together and a bit of a case study about one of the episodes I did in particular that raised some controversy, I should say. So I thought it would be a great case study to look at. So I will dive in here. And as they mentioned, if you guys have any questions, we'll have a little period at the end, but feel free to drop them in the chat and then I can kind of track them as we go. But so great to see everyone today. I'm really excited. So thank you for coming. All right. So yeah, we're calling tonight's session Interviewing Without Bias, how to have a podcast guest you might not agree with and why you should. So I thought this would be a really cool topic because of how I've structured my podcast called Anticulture. And the name is a little bit misleading to people. A lot of people think that that means that I'm against culture or that I'm trying to, you know, stir the pot a little bit. And I am trying to stir the pot, but the title is more so pointing at the fact that how we look at culture and identity in the Western world can be a little bit misleading to people. And I think we've gotten in the habit of placing people in different boxes based on maybe one or two things we know about them without actually taking the chance to get to know their full story and where they're coming from. And chances are, in case someone is clinically insane, their story, even if you don't understand it, has some meaning tied to it. And I think that is a more powerful definition of culture. And when we look at people that way, and when we actually take the time to talk to them, instead of putting them in those boxes, we can actually find out where the root of their belief system or practices or culture in a more narrow sense is coming from. So yeah, so that's kind of been my goal with the podcast Anticulture, and I'll be getting into more of how I formulated that opinion. Let me just see if I can, there we go. So before we get started, I did want to introduce myself. I know some of you haven't met me in person yet. So my name is Josiah Sinanan. I'm 26 and I'm actually a Calgary native. So one of those rare people that was born and raised here in the city. And yeah, I love being from Calgary. I think we're such a friendly city. I think there's a lot of great resources available in our community. And one of those being the public library. I also have worked at the drop-in center downtown. So I have my pulse on kind of a bunch of different areas of the city. And I went to a private Christian school most of my life here in Calgary, but I also was homeschooled for a little bit. So definitely used the library many times and really excited to be a part of this with them. Kind of a cool full circle moment for me as a born and bred Calgarian. My background is actually in international relations. So that's my degree from U of C, and I graduated in 2017. But throughout my degree, I had some really cool experiences that really helped to broaden my understanding of culture and how I understand it today. One of those is that I lived in Paris, France for the year of 2015, which was really great, really eye-opening, especially to see a city so foreign to me in an academic perspective. And then kind of by contrast, my next kind of adventure after that during my degree was living in Sierra Leone in West Africa for 3 months. And I actually worked with a nonprofit there, which was really cool. That was probably one of my most challenging cultural moments, I would say, in my life, that really broadened my understanding of people. And I actually have an interview with the founder of that nonprofit in season 2 that I would highly recommend as we kind of traverse what, different cultures look like. And especially when we place ourselves in those foreign places or in those unfamiliar areas with people that we might not understand or might not agree with us face to face, we really get the biggest benefit out of that. And so I'm really thankful for those opportunities. And that led me to start kind of planting the seeds of anticulture, which I started in January of 2017. So it's crazy to think that it's been more than 3 years. And it's, as I mentioned before, it's really focused on taking people out of their boxes and really listening to their true stories. And part of the story with that, I'll get into it a little bit more, is my own journey growing up, being born and raised in Alberta in Western Canada, but also having a mixed race family and just kind of navigating what my identity meant and dealing with the frustrations of having people either assume what my background is or not, or just kind of treat me like I'm a mutt essentially, because that's what I was, that's what I grew up as. And it was really weird to kind of put those things together in my head, because on one side of my family, I had my upbringing that was very Albertan, and my mom's side of the family is multi-generational from our province, and they have farmland in northern Alberta. And I really understand kind of that settler heritage side of things. But then on the other side of my family, I know what it's like for my dad, who is a second generation immigrant coming to the country. So very interesting to navigate some of those racial conversations growing up. And I have never really fully settled on my cultural identity myself. So I thought it would be fun to kind of play with that and just kind of loosen the borders we put around that concept. So right now, I actually work for a marketing agency called Arcade Studios in Inglewood. And it's a little bit separate from my podcast and my degree, but I love my job. I get to do a lot of copywriting and brand representation for digital advertising and social media. And we have a bunch of clients that we work with on a day-to-day basis. So I've been there for almost 2 years now. And a fun fact about that job is we kind of got a little bit of local attention because we were running all of John Krasinski's social channels when he did Some Good News over quarantine. So that was really awesome. I was in charge of the Twitter, which was really fun. I really like Twitter as a social media channel, just as a side note. And for those of you who are wanting to start a podcast, I would highly recommend being in the know with Twitter, because that seems to be where people like to share their commentary. So it's interesting that podcasts and Twitter go hand in hand on the social spectrum, but I think it's because they're less visual platforms. And I think people that listen to podcasts or produce podcasts, they are really interested in the power of words, and that includes myself. And so, I'll show my Twitter handle a little bit later, but I have one for the podcast and for myself, and it's a great community on there. So just a fun little fact there. I have to figure out how to, there we go. So so I kind of already touched on this. On the right there, that's my most recent logo for season 3, which has evolved over time and has been kind of fun to play around with. But anticulture is, as I said, growing up in Alberta to a mixed race family and struggling to talk to people about cultural identity. I kind of wanted to highlight that story. And I think it's a very common story, even though we might not wrap our heads around it. And I think that that's something that I am definitely guilty of as well. I think it's very easy to assume based on people's backgrounds, or if you meet their family, or if you just hear where their heritage is from, it's very easy to kind of categorize them once you start to know people in different circles. And actually something that's really interesting about that is growing up, a lot of people that had a distinct culture would really open up to me about their racial experiences without knowing where I'm from. And I thought that was really interesting because I would hear very unsolicited conversation from white people and people who aren't whites and native people that are here in Alberta. And all of them were very candid about their experiences with me, I think because of my cultural ambiguity. So part of the original idea with that was I wanted to just focus on Alberta and also just kind of highlight that people have these thoughts that they don't always share with everyone in their own experiences. And I think it goes across the board. I think there is a racial story to every single person. There's a experience and a concept of who you are that ties to your blood. And I think that it's different for everyone. There's not a one size fits all story. And I think this is a very contentious topic, especially nowadays. And yeah, I would say the show's not completely focused on race, but I do think it is a very interesting tie-in because people are very proud of where they come from. They're proud of their family's heritage. And it does set a foundation for how a lot of people see the world. So that was kind of the initial thought. And my little tagline here is, it's a podcast that seeks to challenge and reestablish our view on what culture and identity really mean by listening intently to the unique experiences of those around us. The true culture of an individual and their lives is only found when we take the time to hear what they have experienced from their own point of view. So season 1 was really simple. I was very nervous to get started. I just had a little microphone that I got off Amazon and edited everything myself on GarageBand, and it was a lot of work. So the first season was only 5 episodes long, and it was all focused on Alberta. And I think in my mind, I was either going to do one episode with different Alberta perspectives, or it was going to be the whole season. And I quickly realized that our province is so diverse and there's so many stories that are worth telling. And so that was really fun. I actually ended up talking to an Indigenous person that does not identify as Albertan at all and does not want to, even though their family is from this land. And then I also had a very racist person on the show from Northern Alberta. And I also had, all sorts of people that have diverse backgrounds that kind of show the spectrum of what the stereotype of Alberta is. And my goal with that was to kind of eradicate the stereotype a little bit. It was difficult for me to talk to, for example, this guest that had a lot of prejudice against First Nations people and immigrants and didn't want Alberta to become a mosaic. Also strange that they were willing to talk to me when I'm obviously not from that background, but I thought it was so valuable to have that conversation, because I think when we have an idea of where someone's coming from and it might grind some gears within us, we tend to avoid that. And I think that getting to the root of why that person thinks the way they do, it allows us a little bit of space for, this might not be the right word, but a little bit of empathy. And I think that empathy in a sense of, I don't feel bad for them and I don't want to get on their side, but empathy in a sense of, now I understand why you developed that way of thinking, and we can actually have a civil conversation that doesn't have to be hateful or cut off at the root. And so that was really my heart with that. And it's been challenging for sure. But I learned a lot that first season. I tried to kind of challenge myself to release an episode every single week when that came out. And I would literally be editing the episode on the Monday and try to release it on Friday. And it was a lot of work, but I'm really happy I did it. And it's also kind of been in my minds too, that I've always wanted to host something and have people on and spark conversation. So this was a really cool way to do it. And I think that's the beauty of podcasting, is that anyone can do it, and you can create a platform for yourself, which can be really beneficial, I think, if you have a niche that you want to fill and a voice that you want to make heard. A lot of people now, we have the opportunity to do that, which is really cool. So that was great. Season 2 was quite a bit more broad. As I mentioned, I interviewed the founder of that Sierra Leonean nonprofit at the beginning of that season. And it's actually also the season where I got to interview the guest that we're highlighting today. So I decided to spread out from Alberta and just kind of find more high profile stories that would also include some subcultures and not so much be focused on race and culture. So for example, I started doing some subculture focuses, and another interesting guest that I had that season was actually one of the Real Housewives of Vancouver, which is kind of a funny person to have on the podcast. But I thought it would be a really cool opportunity because the guest that I did have, I'm guessing most of you haven't watched the show, but if you have, Mary Zilba was my guest, and she is, this is a little side note about myself, but I love the Real Housewives franchise. And I just felt like she was so victimized on the show, and I thought it would be really interesting to have her on the podcast because there is a assumption we all have baseline. Oh, someone was on this trashy reality show. That must mean this, this, and this. And so in that example, we're doing the exact same thing we would do by putting people in cultural boxes as well. So I just kind of wanted to challenge that. And we actually had a really intelligent and interesting conversation. And she expressed that she regrets being on the show because of the stereotype that's associated with it. And so that was really cool to kind of get to the root of that and realize that, hey, this is maybe a theme that's running across the board for most of humanity. We feel like once we're put in a box, we're limited to our story, and not a lot of people take the time to hear it. So after that, I really took the plunge, and this most recent season I did, season 3, was kind of my biggest risk yet. I decided to do 10 full episodes. I recorded everything in a studio. I did 2 episodes actually based in Paris, which was really cool to kind of revisit that part of my life and look at how culture is treated in a different setting. And it really, really was a great launch pad, I would say, this season. So I got, I reached out to the Alberta Podcast Network, which used to be an ATB partnership, and they signed me onto their network, and I got some studio time with a great little studio in Inglewood called We Edit Podcasts. And I would definitely recommend them if you're starting out and you want to not worry about all the audio editing and the audio quality. They have a great studio, which was a bit of an investment, but I really wanted to make it a bit of a higher brow project, which definitely paid off. I saw my subscribers go from about 100 to now about 650. So really big jump this past season. And I would say it was definitely worth it. And another challenge I gave myself that season was I actually had 2 or 3 guests per episode, kind of covering a thematic topic rather than focusing on individual stories. So that was really cool too, to tie those that string in a different way. And I don't know if I'll do that format again because it was a lot of work, but I do think it was really cool to kind of challenge myself in that setting. And I would recommend, if you haven't heard the show yet, season 3 is a really good place to start to really see kind of that depth. But if any of those other episodes interested you, I'd also recommend them. So it's been really tough for me as a podcaster, just as a side note, to adjust to what has happened this year with COVID, and very hard to nail down guests when people don't want to meet in person, obviously, or come to the studio. The studio was closed for most of the year, and I kind of did lose a bit of my motivation with what happened. And that was, I think a lot of people have dealt with that. But what I ended up doing was I released 2 bonus episodes throughout this time, just over the phone interviews. And it was actually really cool how it worked out. They were kind of random connections that popped up and fit really well into the theme for anti-culture. So I did an episode actually on Alberta's Black history, which was really, really cool and ended up being super timely over the month of February. That coincided with the release of a film that actually chronicled Alberta's, the history of Alberta's Black settlers. So actually a new project just came out recently about a founder or a settler named John Ware, who is the man who introduced longhorn cattle into our province. So really interesting because this settler is, like, if you think of longhorn cattle, obviously that's a Texan thing, but you think of Alberta beef, you think of Alberta culture, that's a huge pinnacle of our stereotype. And that was brought up by a Black man. So really cool to see that there's actually a whole story that we don't actually get taught in our own province. And I think that that was really eye-opening for me and just really opened my network a bit more, and really cool to focus on Alberta again for that one. And then the second one was actually a two guys that worked on this film called Digging in the Dirt. And it was a CBC film. And essentially what they were chronicling was the mental health effects of men in the oil fields in Alberta, which also was really cool and timely that that opportunity came. And I got to talk to them about that side of our stereotype. And their documentary is really interesting. So really cool that that still worked out. And I kind of got to challenge myself to push past those barriers. And yeah, I'm working right now on putting together a season 4. There's been a couple other projects that have come up this summer, but I'm building my guest list, and I am really looking forward to making it a little bit better too. I'm not sure how I'm going to challenge myself this time around, but something cool about podcasting too that I learned doing this is, it might not be cool actually, but most of the podcasts that are on the podcast hosting apps, so Spotify or Apple Podcasts, for example, I think it's only 1/3 of all podcasts registered are actually active. So a lot of people give up after a first season, or they decide to move on once it doesn't take off right away. And I think it's really important to highlight that it is a slow burn. And if you're really passionate about it and you have a niche that you're covering, it's always worth it to keep going, because you never know who's going to find your show. You never know what kind of message you're going to relay. And it can be a really amazing tool. So really happy about that. And here's just some pictures from my time producing the seasons. Yes, I used to have blonde hair, so that was around for a bit, but this is the studio here from We Edit Podcasts. This is a live event I did with the founder of that NGO. And then I believe this is from season 2. So yeah, really fun to get my feet wet in that. And I just wanted to share these examples of some quote graphics from my episodes that I put together. The one here on the left is from season 1. And this is from the gentleman that I mentioned who doesn't want to identify as Albertan. And really interesting, he said, if I were to say I was Canadian, it would make me feel like I lost my identity. I am Nisitipi. And then this next one on the right is from the episode we'll be looking at today, and it's from Rachel Dolezal, who I'll get into shortly. And she says, I've had to, for my entire life, fight against this evidence that the way I think and feel is not okay. But at the same time, I have to be me. I can't feel another way. And that was a really controversial quote to put from her. But I think these jarring examples of what people say about their identity, it's really eye-opening that there is something going on that we should be talking about. So yeah, so we're going to get into Rachel Dolezal. I don't know, if everyone is familiar with her or not, but she had a bit of a, I guess, press frenzy in around 2015, actually. So the story is kind of spread out throughout a lot of different outlets, but essentially this woman here on the right, she identifies as Black, and she's actually not Black at all. She has no genetics that would make her from Africa. She is a Caucasian woman. And it was a really, really interesting story at the time, and very scandalous, obviously very insulting to a lot of people, because she had a bunch of big titles. She was a professor of African studies. She also was the president of the NAACP in Washington State. And that's a big role to fill, telling people that you are a race that you're not. So really, really interesting that she came up on my radar, but she has had, basically a bunch of negative press around her. She was on Dr. Phil and really grilled about her identity, which she continually affirmed that she is Black. And she never, the interesting thing about her, she never actually set up to be discovered. She actually was caught in the midst of a legal battle for one of her adopted siblings who is Black, who was abused by her biological brother. So she was in court dealing with that, and her parents were really trying to protect her biological brother. And basically what happened was they said, you can't trust anything Rachel's saying because she's actually not even Black. And when she walked out of the courtroom one day, a reporter approached her and asked her directly if she was, and she was kind of flabbergasted. And it became a bit of a meme, and then it really blew up. And strangely, she accepted a lot of press requests at the time. And then she kind of went silent. And until 2018, there was a Netflix documentary that came out about her, and I would definitely recommend watching it. It's really interesting. And it's called The Rachel Divide. So it was really interesting, and it kind of highlighted that there's two sides to this and not just the one side, which I thought was really interesting and risky journalism to even say that. But watching the documentary, there's so many people that are against her, but the strange thing that kept popping up was these people that knew her even before she was outed and have decided to stand by her side. And they just had this outlook on her that they understood her as a person and not kind of about this scandal. And it was hard for me to watch, because I definitely don't think that anyone should be identifying as a race that they're not, especially African American, when there's such a rich history of everything that they've gone through that she cannot relate to at all. So it was weird. I was watching this and I thought, she hasn't really gotten into detail about why and when she decided to make this outrageous statement. And while I was watching the documentary, I was like, she would be really interesting to have on anticulture, and I want to get her on. So it was really good timing. She just had a book come out called In Full Color, and super weird story. But after I watched the documentary and was kind of feeling like intrigued by her story, I actually ordered the book. And when I got the order confirmation, it was from a personal email address that looked like it was Rachel's email address. And I just kind of got this, like, my heart started pounding, and I was like, well, I guess I could try to email her and pitch her my show and see what happens. And I might as well try. And so I just replied to my order confirmation receipt and outlined kind of my heart and my show, and obviously was being as nice as possible and very cautious, because since the documentary came out, she decided not to do any more press because she feels like she's been set up a lot of times. And surprisingly, she expressed interest and gave me her phone number, and we were planning a date. And then the week after, she actually got involved with some kind of legal situation. So she wasn't allowed to do any press until it had resolved. So I was really disappointed, because I felt so encouraged to have her on the show and excited. And I was brainstorming all my questions and like putting notes in her book. And basically it was delayed by almost a year. And I had almost given up on trying to reach her, because she kept kind of pushing me aside and saying the case has been moved and et cetera, et cetera. And at the time I was kind of like, I don't know if she's just saying this because she doesn't want to do the show, or if she actually can't. But it had been months of not contacting her, and I just texted her again and tried one more time near the end of my season that season, and she agreed, and we went through with it, and we had a phone interview that was very intimidating for me to undertake. And I was a little bit worried that it would bring on a lot of bad attention and that a lot of people would listen to it and criticize my interviewing skills. But I decided it was worth the risk to put myself out there and also to take a different angle with Rachel. So in my mind, I knew that she was the perfect guest because I couldn't agree with what she stood for, but I also knew that I needed to challenge myself as a journalist and be true to what I say about my show. Even if I don't agree with someone, I want to find out the root of their story. So so I just wrote a little episode description that I'll share with you that I thought was pretty eye-catching, but it says, Rachel Dolezal made international headlines after being outed in 2015 for being born white after telling a large group of people she was Black. The real story of her identity choice might be more compassion-worthy and easier to understand than you'd think once we give her a chance to share her journey. Learn what Rachel thought about her Netflix documentary and how she describes the difference between Black and African American and which one she is, and why she thinks her journey to adopt her inner identity differs from someone like Caitlyn Jenner. So also very interesting timing. The same year this story came out was also the story with Caitlyn Jenner. And Rachel had kind of a counter argument that was popular on the shows she was on, where it's like, if Caitlyn can say that she was born a woman and can now live that out, why can't I say that I'm Black and can now live that out? And I thought that was a really intriguing point. So we got into that in the show. So I did receive a lot of backlash for this. And I actually have an example of that. I feel like you guys are just learning that I love drama, but I thought this was a really interesting DM I got, and I wanted to kind of be candid and share that and my response. So I got a message that said, I came across your post for the episode on Rachel. I'm not familiar with your work and I haven't listened to the episode, but I wonder why you would have a person like her talk about culture, specifically her experiences co-opting Black culture. Rachel has been in blackface pretending for most of her adult life. There's nothing inspiring about her being herself because she's been pretending. She's a white woman. Does your podcast address this at all, or is it just an opportunity for her to say her story? And I'm a little embarrassed at my response, but I wanted to kind of paint what I was thinking in the moment. So I said, thank you so much for reaching out. All extremely valid and true comments concerning Rachel. My intention was not to give her a platform, but rather to dig deeper into her experiences as a human. I do not agree or condone her behavior, especially as someone of mixed background myself. I did learn a lot from her story that I didn't know before though, and I believe her experience in discovering herself is one that is genuine. I think as a journalist, the opportunity to exercise digging deeper and being empathetic to every human is one that is needed. She's easy to hate, but I refuse to hate. The episode, along with the Rachel Divide Netflix film, are ways we can understand her experience and respect her without agreeing with her. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts after the episode. So something I just want to point out there too is the word genuine. So I think an opportunity we have as journalists is we have an opportunity to discern whether or not someone is telling their true story. And I think it becomes evident when you talk to someone and sit down with them what their experience really is. So even though her experience might be wrong, does that mean that it's not genuine? And that's a challenging question that I think a lot of people struggle with today. And I feel like more than ever, we're in a divided world, and it's very easy to just write someone off or think that they're misled because of their experiences. And even though that might be true, their experience to them is genuine to them. So I think there's just a way of thinking there that is very intriguing to me, and I have to be careful with, but that's my heart behind the episode. So yeah, just wanted to talk about how I structured the interview a little bit. One thing that was really scary for me was doing the phone interview with her, because I was used to kind of seeing people in person, people in person at the time. And I was a little nervous that my empathy and my voice wouldn't really come out properly in the phone, or that she would get defensive, or what I would do if I'm recording this and something crazy happens. Everything did go well on that front. And to be honest with you, I don't know how many of you have heard the episode, but it's actually funny to think about, because I wasn't able to get the studio for this episode. So I literally held my phone on speakerphone in front of the microphone for the episode. And it worked out well. So that was really nerve-wracking. I wanted to make sure that the people who heard this episode knew that I had good quality production, but I had to work with what I had. So that was really a challenge that first came to mind. The second thing I wanted to do was I really wanted to acknowledge my bias. I needed to know where I stood, and I needed to make sure that while I interviewed her, it wasn't an episode where she's trying to convince me of something, or an episode where I'm trying to prove her wrong. I think it's important. She's obviously already rooted in her ways. So I also needed to be rooted in where I stood with what I thought about her story. And it was a tough one for me, to be honest, because obviously my heart behind the whole podcast is that people have all these different experiences, and obviously hers is very unique. And now that it's out that she isn't actually a Black woman, it's curious that we know that now, yet she still identifies as that, and that makes her a very enigmatic person. She has an experience that obviously must be very unique to create that scenario. So that was on one side of my head. On the other side of my head, it was very confusing because I know that this is something that is very hurtful to people. I obviously know how important it is to identify with your race correctly. And I have been personally hurt when people misidentify who I am. And that is a big deal to me. And I think it's a big deal to a lot of people. So I knew going in that I didn't agree with anything that she was claiming, but I did know also going in that she is a person, and an educated person, that is a professor and a mom. And I just thought about, how do I actually get to the heart of what's going on? And is she going to talk about what formulated these thoughts in her mind? And it is very interesting talking to her because she has a distinct memory of drawing herself as a kid with brown crayon on all of her drawings, which I thought was really interesting. But what I discovered was that she has had a lot of hurt in her life too. And her parents were very abusive and controlling. And her two adoptive siblings, who are Black, played a big role in her life. And she felt like she had to protect them from her abusive family, and identified with them quite young in her life, growing up in a remote area of Montana in the mountains. And she just has this disdain for her birth family and a heart for her adoptive siblings, which I thought was really interesting, that there's kind of a mix of trauma and empathy. And I don't think that that's something that a lot of people looked at. Another thing that I discovered that was really interesting was the legal case surrounding her story, and how she didn't have a plan to out herself as who she really was, because she didn't see herself that way. She was outed in a situation that was very emotional, where she was trying to protect her sister who had been abused, and that was taken advantage of, which I thought was really harsh and really cruel timing for anyone to go through. So that was where I kind of found my angle, where I found my empathy for her is, we can't say if we lived the exact same life as her, how we would turn out. So yeah, it is very interesting how it happened. And she has a quote in her book that I write here, and she says, "To truly understand someone, you need to hear their side of the story. This is mine." And that really resonated with me, in line with what I'm trying to do with my podcast. I also had to ask myself how I would approach her and what facts I was missing. So I was very open-minded to the idea that there is probably parts of the story that I don't know. There's probably parts of the story that she hasn't put in her book and she hasn't been vocal about that she might surprise me with. And I have to be ready to continue on the conversation map that I've drawn out for us during our talk. So I just wanted to also highlight some key questions that I asked her during the episode. I won't get into her response fully on all of them, but I just wanted to kind of give you an insight into what I had planned. So I did ask her, what do you think is the difference between cultural and racial identity? Why do you think people look at this situation differently than other alternative identifiers? What is the difference between being Black and being African American to you? Which one do you identify as? Do you think racializing aspects of a culture is part of the root of prejudice? How does your life look now? How are you moving forward? And what do you say to people who still disagree with you? And I was very thoughtful about these questions. I wanted to give her a chance to be as clear as possible. These are questions that I don't think she has answered in other scenarios. So I was curious. That's another part of it. And another part of it is these questions are all, if you really think about them, they are designed not to be offensive or like I should say on the offense. I'm not trying to get her to try to defend herself. Instead, I'm trying to listen to what she believes. And I think that's a really important thing to do as you host a podcast or as you have a guest, rather than have these loaded questions, which Rachel is very used to. I wanted to, instead of pointing them out, I wanted to kind of allow her to expand on her thinking. So detailed questions like, what is the difference between being Black and African American, and what do you identify as? That was very interesting because she had a very specific answer and she had thought about it. And I thought that was really fascinating because I think a lot of people just kind of wouldn't think that far or allow her the chance to expand on that. And another thing that's important to recognize that I've learned doing podcasting is when people have gone through a difficult situation or they have been hurt or traumatized, I think we get frustrated with people that have been in those situations because we feel like they don't speak up and they don't explain themselves well. And that's something that I've struggled with my whole life. Even if I'm watching a show and I'm like, just tell them what you really think, like just, defend yourself a little better. And a lot of people don't have that skill. And I think unless we are empathetic to start with and start getting deeper into how they think or even challenging how they think, that's when the story comes out, and it probably will surprise you. So I just wanted to highlight that. And I just wanted to encourage you, kind of as we get near the end here, to continue to interview without bias. Even in a situation, you might not even have a podcast, but while you talk to people in your professional life, this is a really important key, I think, to remove yourself. And that's kind of the challenge with Rachel is I recognized I did have a bias, but how did I deflate that? So a couple things to note is I'm not on a network. I'm not a big name yet, but while I'm independent, I need to establish myself as a journalist and allow my voice to be very distinct, because if I do go into this further in my career, or I sign on to a bigger project, my voice remains the same because that's how my reputation has been built. So I think to encourage you, if you have a podcast, this is your chance now to be very clear about where you stand and also to interview in a different way that is against the grain from the divisive narrative that we're encouraged to participate in. So that's kind of how I look at it. It's kind of like going against the system, but also being interesting. Second point is never burn bridges. And I think that this is a huge point as well. You never know who's connected to who or who will be invested in what or who will listen to your episode. And I think when you approach people without bias from a human perspective, you protect that burning bridges potential. And it's a hard thing to do, but I think it's so worth it. Even if you do have issues with someone, always when you approach people, it's important to remove your bias and listen to their story. And it's something we all have to practice and get better at. So yeah, just kind of going off of that, the time to stand your ground will arise and you will get to paint it indirectly. And that's kind of adhering to some of the questions I did ask Rachel, and even in our conversation, I don't think by the end of the interview, she didn't think I was for or against her. But for example, in my response to that DM, that was my chance to kind of stand my ground and not be divisive in that sense. And I think that is true journalism. I think that's how you get the real stories. You don't find a story to use it for an agenda. Instead, you find a story to tell a story. Yeah, and another great example of just being ready and on the spot. Once you kind of get that mindset in your head, you're able to kind of adapt to a lot of situations, which can be really useful. So this is the questions that you guys have been sent before you join the Zoom. So I did want to kind of leave some space if people had responses to that to participate. And so I'll open the floor if you have a question, and then we can kind of have a little bit of a discussion. Or if you have any other questions that aren't listed here, you can let me know. See, I'm not sure how this will be moderated, but.
I'm happy to go first.
Sure. Hi, Asha.
Hi, Josiah. This has been so informative, and you're so talented and gifted at hearing people's stories. And I'm excited for your next season of the podcast because I think you're so needed, especially in this time, in this current climate where understanding of different cultures is so imperative, because I think so much of the misunderstanding, the turmoil is just based in ignorance, and not even ignorance by choice, but just lack of spaces to have dialogue. I guess, so are you asking me one of these questions, or do I ask you?
I'm asking you guys these questions. So if you have thoughts about these, let me know. Or if you have a question for me, it can be either way.
Whatever you prefer.
It's up to you.
How about you ask me?
Okay, I am curious, how would you approach this interview differently if you had the opportunity to talk to Rachel?
Honestly, I think I would have approached it a lot worse. In watching the documentary, I definitely had my own bias as a Black woman. But I do feel like there was 5% of me that paused when she did bring up the comparison with Caitlyn Jenner, because I hadn't thought about it in that context. But I think that I would have been probably a lot more hostile. I thought that you did such a great job of staying neutral, staying calm, and staying really objective. So I think your approach was a lot better. I would not have done a great job.
Nice. Okay, I'll ask you one more because that was good. Okay, what do you think about the perspective that I might be giving a platform to someone that I don't agree with? So say we're back in time and I'm interviewing Hitler. Would that be a wrong thing to do? Am I giving him a platform? What's your perspective on that?
It's a great question. And I think about like Barbara Walters with her iconic interviews that she's conducted with all sorts of public figures, from loved political figures to hated political figures. I think everyone deserves to be heard. Every story needs to be heard. But I think the intent is important as you go into interviewing someone, being very clear with your audience, with your the person you're interviewing, what your intent is. And as long as your intention is very clear and your goal of that interview is very clear, then I think everyone deserves to be heard, for sure.
Awesome, great response.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna mute myself, but thank you for this beautiful platform to have dialogue.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Cool. Okay. Anyone else have questions or want to be asked a question?
Can I ask you a question, Josiah?
Yeah, of course.
I agree with Asha. I think this is a much needed voice in this space as well. I'm curious because you mentioned in your previous slide this idea of true journalism. And I mean, Asha threw down Barbara Walters, kind of like an old school, very trusted when we think about kind of these, the Walter Cronkites and all this. And now, I mean, you've talked about it as well in terms of like how divisive, even, what is true journalism. So many people now can just create a platform without any background around journalism. And that actually potentially gets more views or more, oh, I agree with this person, but, it's chasing the, well, will I get more views or am I telling the real story? I don't know how you, because, for you, you even said it in your previous slide that part of it too is establishing yourself with some credibility or getting, I guess, more listens to your podcast. But how do you see that balance between true journalism versus just getting people to listen in any way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's weird for me because I think part of me has this passion in my heart that I don't want to see journalism be the way that it has been. And so I'm really committed to pivoting that and kind of making my own stand and changing how we talk to people. And that's a big motivator for even starting the podcast in the first place. So when I think about that, I'm reminded that my goal isn't usually to get a bunch of listens or a bunch of subscribers. Obviously, that would be amazing. And in the back of my head, that is a goal. But that's not why I'm doing it. And I think people are really craving this type of dialogue, and people are looking for something that isn't going to trigger them or cause an uproar, especially now. And I think it's going to be the future of how people report, hopefully. And I want to contribute to that. So yeah, it's a tough balance to strike. I think my whole life I felt like I have to choose one side or another in a lot of instances, and it's been challenging for me. So for me, it's the type of journalism that I'm drawn to because I hate it when people are misunderstood or don't have a chance. And I think that there's amazing stories that we miss out on when we don't have that as part of our dialogue. So yeah, great question. I think for me, it's very much motivated by that I want to change the system more so than I want to get a lot of views, and and you can still stir up controversy without having people to take sides. For example, this episode. So yeah, it's interesting. Great question.
Yeah, no, like Justin and Asha, like I love what you're doing, like with the podcast and how, yeah, you're just coming like with a perspective of true journalism and telling like the story, and just like even in regard of like giving people a platform, and is it wrong to interview someone that you don't share like views with and stuff. I just think that it's important like not to only surround ourselves with people that we only agree with, because if you're only surrounded by people that are like you, then just you'll only ever know like one part of like society or like the world. And especially by giving like these people to like the opportunity to like talk and like voice their story, I think so often they're being told that, oh, like what you're saying is problematic and it's wrong, which it very well might be. But if they're always on like the defensive, then you don't give them like the space to take a step back and like reflect like why what they think or what they're identifying as, or like things like that are problematic. So I don't think that it's necessarily like giving people like a platform, but it's like giving them an opportunity to kind of like put their guard down and actually like listen to like
Totally.
other people's like concerns. So yeah, that's just kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think there's nothing wrong with asking questions like, what do you think about these people that disagree with you? But I do think you have to get to that place first. You have to give them that ability to be trusted. And then they really give you the real answer instead of defending themselves. So that's kind of been cool about this podcast too, is I know that without this tool, I would not be able to reach the people that I have as guests. I would not probably sit down and talk to half these people, but because I have a podcast, it gives me an excuse to, and it's really fun and interesting in that way. And it's really broadened my perspective as well.
Just kind of curious, it seemed like when you're interviewing in the first part of the podcast, there's a emphasis on building a relationship. And is there a balance between building a relationship with someone you're interviewing or sticking to more objective journalistic kind of style, or sort of where does that kind of fit in?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think it depends on who I'm interviewing. If it's someone I'm already familiar with, I kind of know how they want to be presented. if it's someone like Rachel, it's really hard for me to know what she's expecting. I'm sure she was afraid to talk to me a little bit because she's been duped by the press a lot. So I think it's a big value no matter who I'm interviewing, but more so with her because I needed her to feel safe and I needed her to know that I wasn't going to, turn on her and do something that would embarrass her or violate what I told her I would do. So part of getting her to be on the podcast was establishing that you can trust me. And so I kind of had to prove that, it felt like, at the beginning of the show. And I think it really helped direct the rest of the interview. But yeah, great question. Thanks for listening to the episode. Awesome. That might be it then. I have one last slide here. Just if you guys want to keep in touch, I wanted to give you all my information. I would love to hear from you and have you guys check out season 4 when it's ready and catch up on the other episodes. So feel free to reach out to me. I'm at Josiah Podcast on Instagram and Twitter. And you can also listen to the show anywhere you get your podcasts. It'd be awesome to have you check out the other episodes and let me know what you think. And leave a review if you have a chance. And you can also reach me by email if you go to my podcast website, josiahpodcast.com. So a little plug, season 4 is coming, as I said, but if you have any ideas for people I should interview for that next season, definitely get in touch with me. I am looking to fill it up and get started soon. So yeah, I would thank you all for coming. This is awesome. I'm so glad that you all participated and got to hear a little bit more about my show.
Thank you so much, Josiah, for presenting tonight. That was wonderful, super informative, and very interesting on kind of taking that more of that interview style for tonight's PodChats. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Our next PodChat will be on November 12th. So make sure that you register, tell your friends. It should be great. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. I'm just seeing all the messages now. That's crazy. Thank you. Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Josiah. Great
Bye.
presentation.
Thank you.
Catherine, it's just us.
It's just us.
He did a great job. I actually thought that was one of my favorite ones because the people who popped on camera really dug a little bit deeper, had some really genuine questions. If anything, he probably could have gone a little bit longer.
Yeah.
But it's good. And, like having, I think I saw 16 people at one point, which